Today, we'll be talking about an entire Native American village that went missing from the Arctic Circle. So, without further ado, let's get Inuit. I'm Aidan Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Line. It has been said that the Northern Lights have seen queer sights, and one man who would certainly agree with that old verse of poetry was Joe Labelle. It was the year 1930, and as the roving trapper paddled towards the safety and warmth of a familiar and friendly Inuit village on the shoreline of Angikuni Lake, he became aware that something was surely amiss. The collection of huts, usually a bustling little community of some 30 inhabitants, stood still and silent in the cold November air, and not a soul responded when he called out a greeting. Nor did any of the village's huskies, a rather vocal and friendly breed, herald his arrival with their telltale howls. On the shoreline, sealskin kayaks rested on the beach, battered and damaged by what must have been months of wave action. So from the outside, it looked as if the place had been abandoned. But when and why? Throwing open the caribou skin flap of a nearby hut, Joe peered inside to find that it was empty. He called out yet again, but nothing within the structure stirred, and so he went looking once more. He entered another hut and found sealskin clothing sized to fit a child, with an ivory sewing needle still stuck through as if its user had abruptly stopped working. Outside in the common areas, food sat in cooking pots over long cold fire pits, and it seemed that whatever caused the inhabitants to abandon their homes, it had been sudden enough for them to leave most of their belongings behind. But what puzzled him was the presence of their rifles, one of the most important items in the world when it came to survival in the frigid north. He couldn't imagine what course of events would lead the villagers to abandon such a vital tool as they fled into the wilderness. The mystery only deepened when Labelle came across yet another incomprehensible clue some 100 yards from the huts. The village's huskies, tied to a set of tree stumps and sadly deceased, victims of starvation after the flight of their masters. Perhaps the only things more important to an Inuit tribe than its hunting weapons were these prized sled dogs, capable of pulling cargo and people, acting as hunting partners, and keeping their owners warm during the cold winter nights. You see, a tribe's huskies weren't just draft animals, they were family members, and the fact that they were left behind, especially with no chance of escape, implied that something horrible must have happened to the village. Finally, on the opposite side of the encampment, Labelle came across yet another utterly bizarre sight. It was an Inuit burial cairn, but more importantly, it was an open and empty one, with the removed stones stacked neatly in two piles on either side of the structure. An animal such as a polar bear could have been responsible for opening it, but no animal could reasonably be blamed for the organized stacks of rocks. Someone or something intelligent had been here before him, and Labelle did not want to stick around to find out who or what it was. Still, these people were Labelle's friends, and as any good friend should, he made his way south to alert the authorities about what he had found. He took his story to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in the town of Churchill, some 300 miles to the south, and they dispatched a team to go and investigate the matter. The Mounties found that Labelle's description of the village was accurate, but they were just as puzzled as he was. The Mounties summoned experts, though what kind is not made clear, and these men spent 2 weeks in the abandoned settlement, searching for some clue as to what befell its inhabitants. They determined, based on the type of berries found in some of the cooking pots, that the people must have fled at least 2 months prior to Labelle's arrival, but beyond that, nothing could really be found. No tracks led away from the village, the kayaks proved that they had not left by water, and there was no sign of a struggle. It was as if they'd just up and left, and nobody could tell why. As the story goes, the RCMP investigated the matter for months, but their work turned up no trace of even one of the 30 or so members of the village. Or at least, that's how Frank Edwards told the story in his 1959 book, Stranger Than Science, a collection of mysterious tales, which the author insists were studied, documented, checked, and double-checked, and still offer no plausible explanation. In the intervening years between the publishing of that book and today, many other iterations of the story have been told, oftentimes with additional details or embellishments. There are those in the UFO community, for example, who swear that strange lights were seen in the sky not long before Labelle came along. And they also insist that they were not just the northern lights. Others have claimed that Labelle saw smoke rising from campfires and hearths, which would have indicated that people had just been there, and this made the apparent starvation of the huskies all the more strange. And then, as always, there are those who argue that the entire thing is nothing but an old legend. So, what really happened? Well, I spent all day yesterday trying to figure that out, and I did that with the help of my trusty FlexiSpot E7 standing desk. FlexiSpot is a partner we've worked with a number of times, and it's because we genuinely enjoy their products. And today I'm actually going to be talking to you about a newer one, the E7plus, which is like the desk I currently have, but more plus. But it's really what's included in that plus that's what you want to hear about, which is the 540 pounds of static capacity that this desk can handle. That means you and at least one other, potentially two other friends, could all sit on the desk at the same time. Or you could also just load it up with things like your computer, your monitors, and all of those other things you need, and it still won't collapse. And another really nice thing about that is that you don't have to worry about, overloading one side, because the E7 Plus is a four-legged desk, which means that weight distribution is very, very stable. And just to be clear, when I say the E7 Plus standing desk, I don't mean that it just stands there. I mean it can be for standing or sitting. In fact, it has 3-stage legs suitable for all heights. For me, I actually am one of those people who I like to have a different desk height for typing versus like playing a game. So I will make little micro adjustments. We're talking like 1/10 of an inch. And it's very nice that you can do that just by hitting a simple button on a keypad, which also comes with a handy dandy USB charging port. And one of the best parts about FlexiSpot is that it is such a modular product. They've got all sorts of different things like mounts and desk risers that you can just pop right onto it that are built to be just part of the desk. It will not look like you are throwing something together. It's gonna look right, it's gonna have the aesthetic appeal that you want, and it's gonna look beautiful in your home office. Or your office if you roll like that. And of course, if you are not satisfied with the product, there is a 30-day risk-free return policy, and if you are satisfied with the product, but something happens to it, there is a 15-year warranty on your desk. And also, by the way, the chair I'm sitting in right now is a FlexiSpot C7. I think it might be the C7 Plus, actually. It is the most comfortable chair I have. We have like 6 of them here in the studio, and I'm looking at getting one for my home office too, to replace a very well-known brand of chair. So if you would like to see why it is that we love pitching FlexiSpot so much and why it is our standard here at the Lore Lodge for what we use in our own lives, you can head over to FlexiSpot.com and use special code YTE7P50 for $50 off your order. This is a great chance to upgrade your home office with the FlexiSpot E7 Plus 4-leg standing desk. So once again, if you'd like to give it a shot, use our code YTE7P50 at checkout for $50 off. Click the link below to get yours now and experience the ultimate in stability and performance. The story of the vanished village, as it came to be known, is not one without its detractors, and for fair reasons. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police website maintains that the story about the disappearance in the 1930s of an Inuit village near Lake Angikuni is not true, and claims that it derives entirely from Edwards, with there being no evidence to support such a story. And supporting that point is a piece written by author Dwight Whalen, writing for Fate magazine in 1976, whose investigation found that the case for the vanished village rests upon the story of an inexperienced trapper told to an imaginative and not too conscientious newsman. One of the most thorough attempts at debunking the story, however, comes from Skeptoid Media, written by executive director Brian Dunning, who also points to a general lack of primary sources as the primary issue with this legend. Now, Dunning's 2013 article makes a number of very strong points about the narrative provided by Edwards, and one of the first red flags Dunning raises is that of the location. According to the author, November temperatures in the region dip below 10 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 13 degrees Celsius, meaning that the surface of Angikuni Lake should have been a sheet of ice by the time Labelle claimed he was paddling on it. Furthermore, an ice-covered lake would not leave kayaks battered by wave action, calling that aspect of the story into question as well. Dunning also argues that the very presence of kayaks so far inland is suspect, as the lake is over 200 miles from the shores of the Hudson Bay, far from the sealskins and willow branches needed to construct them. And, according to Dunning, the lake is landlocked. In the same vein, Dunning cites the RCMP explanation that a village with a large population would not have existed in such a remote area of the Northwest Territories, that section of which has since been reorganized as the province of Nunavut. But even if it did, he argues that the inhabitants should have been making their clothes out of caribou hide, whereas Edwards claims that the garments Labelle found were made of sealskin. Labelle, were he the experienced trapper he claimed to be, should have known the difference. So, Dunning writes, there was either a series of quite improbable circumstances, or one of the men telling the story was wrong. The key to Dunning's argument, however, is more concrete than simple doubts about how probable these aspects of the story are, and relies on the documentary evidence, or more accurately, the lack thereof. According to the author, the 1976 Fate magazine article by Dwight Whalen cites a November 29, 1930 article in the Halifax Herald as being the origin of the story. Whalen wrote that this article was penned by special correspondent Emmett E. Kelleher, who offered a more reserved version of the artifacts Labelle found. Next came a January 17th release from the RCMP in 1931, authored by Commissioner Cortlandt Starnes, based off of an investigation led by Sergeant J. Nelson. And according to Dunning, Whalen found that Nelson did confirm the existence of Labelle via conversations with local traders, but learned that he only worked in northern Manitoba, the province directly south of Nunavut. This, however, was not the only issue. Whalen was the first to note the 1930 and 1931 articles, writes Dunning, but there does not seem to be any record of any earlier author finding them. Beyond that, Whalen himself said that when he called the RCMP to request information about the reports and the story as a whole, they denied that any investigation ever happened. Aiden, the Canadian mood lighting. Thank you. Many years ago, members of the RCMP, then retired, who had served in the area at the time these events were purported to have happened, 1930, were asked for their comments on the story. They could not confirm it, recalled nothing like it, and were astounded that such a ridiculous tale could be believed. Our files were carefully searched, and no strange craft was ever reported. No one named Joe Labelle ever came to the RCMP in a panic about Lake Angikuni. The RCMP did not send out any search parties. The only records we have on the story are copies of letters to correspondents like yourself, informing the writers that the story is entirely fictitious, eh? Based off of these factors, the issues with the details of the story, the lack of primary sources, and the total dismissal of the story by the alleged investigative agency, Dunning concluded that it seems clear that Frank Edwards' 1959 chapter is indeed the genesis of the tale, apparently made up from the whole cloth. As for Whalen, he suggested that the Fate writer had gambled on the fact that nobody involved in the story was likely to be alive at the time of his writing, and simply invented the article and the report for his own narrative. But that doesn't make much sense either. In the end, Whalen came to the same conclusion as Dunning, that this story was an exaggeration at best, and an outright fabrication at the worst, and therefore, there would be no reason for him to create additional material supporting the story. But as it turns out, the answer was considerably more simple than Dunning had made it out to be. Dunning himself was wrong. Going back to the original sources is sometimes easier said than done, reads the third-to-last paragraph of Brian Dunning's The Vanishing Village of Angikuni Lake. It appears that Dunning, attempting to verify the existence of the material cited by Whalen, reached out to a researcher by the name of Patrick Dirksen at the Millennium Library in Winnipeg, Canada. Dirksen did a record search and was unable to find the 1931 RCMP report, and also searched all other Manitoba newspapers from that day, finding no references to the story at all. The problem, as it turns out, is that Brian Dunning failed to account for one specific detail. The paper cited by Whalen was the Halifax Herald, and Halifax is not in Manitoba. To Dunning's credit, finding sources on such topics has become much easier in the last few years. Thanks to websites like newspaper.com, who did not pay for an ad in this video, researchers don't have to call up city libraries and request microfilms. Instead, we just throw a few keywords, dates, and locations into a search bar, and then everything is at our fingertips. And that's how I found the article in the Halifax Mail. I also found it in the Victoria Daily Times, Sunday Times Signal, Winnipeg Tribune, and the Danville Bee, among some others. But the last of those is actually out of Danville, Virginia, and in an update to his article, Dunning confirmed that he had seen it and would update his conclusion. But the update simply noted that though Kelleher's article was real, it was still dubious as ever, and thus this story should still be considered fictitious. But there's an argument to be made that this story could very well be true. You see, the original version of the story, while on its face largely the same, has several significant differences when it comes to the details. For example, Kelleher's article doesn't say that Labelle found the village in November. In fact, it doesn't say when he found it at all, just that the news of it has just reached the PA on the fringe of civilization. Kelleher published his article in November, meaning that Labelle's story may very well have taken place during the previous summer. If it did, then Dunning's point about the lake being frozen is irrelevant. And beyond that, Labelle reportedly said that the camp looked to have been abandoned for at least a year when he found it. Another such example is that of the sealskin clothing, which Dunning said should have been made of caribou hide. He remarked that if Labelle really was a trapper, he should have known the difference between the two, but Kelleher's article doesn't say anything about sealskin clothing. Instead, Labelle reportedly found deerskin parkas, none of which were in the process of being repaired. Dunning also noted that Edwards also had Labelle describing a permanent settlement of about 30 inhabitants that he'd known for many years, something he cited the RCMP as saying would not have been possible. The issue here is that it's unclear if that's what the RCMP was actually saying, as many of the more recent versions of this legend describe a village of several thousand. It could very well be that the RCMP website is describing a settlement of that size as improbable, whereas a band of 25 to 30 Inuit would be entirely reasonable during the fishing season. Furthermore, Labelle did not describe a permanent settlement to Kelleher, but rather a set of 6 caribou skin tents loosely arranged on the shoreline. Nor did he describe a friendly village that he'd known for many years. In reality, he didn't even say that he recognized the village. So as far as the Kelleher version is concerned, this could very well be the first time Labelle ever laid eyes on the place. There are also issues with the criticisms regarding the location of the story. Dunning argued that since the 1931 report from Nelson said Labelle only worked in northern Manitoba, it seemed unlikely that Labelle would be anywhere near Angikuni Lake. But again, that's not exactly what the report said. According to Nelson, Labelle was considered a newcomer in this country, as the Manitoba records show this to be his first season that he has taken out a trapping license. Nelson clarified that Labelle was known to be located on some of the lakes north of Flin Flon, and that there were doubts as to whether he has ever been in the territories. Just north of Manitoba, however, were the territories, and a shrewd trapper might consider the lack of competition further to the north, as there would be no way of telling a fox skin taken in the territories from a fox skin taken in Manitoba. In addition, it could be that Labelle was a newcomer to Manitoba because he spent his previous years in the territories, and Nelson made no mention of checking with the RCMP offices in Churchill. The other main problem that Dunning pointed out regarding the location was the isolated nature of Angikuni Lake, which he describes as small and landlocked so far inland on the Barrens that neither willow nor sealskin were available. But in reality, Angikuni Lake has a surface area of 197 square miles and is connected to the Hudson Bay by a series of smaller lakes and rivers. And Dunning's argument that this would be the farthest inland that the historical use of igloo-licked kayaks would have ever been documented lacks a source and is, in all honesty, nonsensical. Angikuni is also directly connected to Baker Lake by the Kazan River, making it a very reasonable place for Inuit of that area to travel in search of food and furs. So when you look at the Kelleher article, most of Dunning's argument completely falls apart. Essentially every single point against the story being true only works if you use Edwards' version, while the Kelleher version is largely plausible. Furthermore, some of the details of the earlier account not mentioned in the Skeptoid article actually lend some credence to the story. The situation with the huskies, for example, is very different. Kelleher wrote that there were 9 in total, not 7, that they were lying around as opposed to being tied to stumps, and most importantly, 2 of them are still alive. Huskies tied to a tree and left to starve is an odd situation, but huskies roaming about the village and dying of hunger because they're absurdly passive and emotional creatures is very believable. And speaking of absurdly emotional creatures, Archie needed some attention too. He's so good.
Ella likes the teleprompter.
In any case, another such detail is that of the cairn, which differs slightly from Edward's version in that there was no mention of neatly stacked rock piles. Instead, Labelle described it simply as having been opened and emptied with the stones cast aside in a pile. The reason that's interesting is that in 1948, a cairn was discovered at the lake, and it was described as not of normal Eskimo construction. And the same passage describing the cairn also notes that Lake Angikuni was, at the time, near a famous junction where the Eskimo trade routes between Churchill and the Arctic coasts converge. The one aspect that can't easily be explained about the Kelleher article is the issue of the RCMP, who Kelleher said had investigated the matter, and yet to this day categorically deny the existence or disappearance of the village. This could be a simple issue of poor record keeping, it could suggest something more sinister, or it could just be that Kelleher invented this part of the story for some reason. There just isn't evidence pointing in any of those directions, and the RCMP can't really be trusted to tell the truth about missing native people even today. So what did happen? Labelle's suggestion, via Kelleher, was certainly imaginative. Then I thought of the Eskimos' evil spirit, Tornrark, the article quotes Labelle, who has an ugly man's face with two long tusks sticking up from each side of the nose. The natives live in fear of Tornrark, and they wear charms to ward him off. I thought about Tornrark, and I had to make an effort to put the picture out of my mind. Now, there is frustratingly little that can be said about this entity, which it seems is properly known as Torngarsuk, other than that he is a very important spirit or deity within the Inuit pantheon. One of the few English language sources available regarding the topic, an entry in the Bulletin of the United States National Museum from the years 1877 to 1878, describes him as the highest oracle, the master spirit of these people, who signifies the greatest spirit of good as well as of evil. There is a considerable corpus of work on the topic as it pertains to the Greenland Inuit, but it's largely in Danish, and the English source I could find summarizing that research begins with, given the present source material, we may never reach any final accord about Torngarsuk's roles in native religion and worldview, largely because linguistic, historic, and theoretical variables are among those that confuse the original and modified depictions of Torngarsuk in most sources. Labelle reportedly said that he visited about a dozen other Inuit villages during his trapping trip, and that any Inuit he asked about the missing village blamed it on Torngarsuk, but this could have been something of a misunderstanding regarding that figure's role in their lives. There were some clues as to what could have happened, chiefly the mysterious appearance of two Inuit with no explanation of their background. Kelleher wrote that a tribe living about 150 miles north of the abandoned camp, possibly the Baker Lake band of Inuit, has adopted a 10-year-old Eskimo boy who seems to have wandered into camp one day a few months ago and who does not belong to any of the nearby camps. But the boy and the tribe are reticent about things, and nobody has learned anything from them so far. Given the relationship between the RCMP and the natives at the time, it's unsurprising that a tribe would not be forthcoming, and the next story in the article makes it clear why that would be. According to Kelleher, another time an Eskimo named Salmek was brought down to a hospital on the Hudson Bay Railway for treatment for frozen legs. It was thought that he might know something about it, so, after a long search, an Eskimo was found who could speak Salmek's dialect, and he began to question him. Salmek didn't want to talk, though, and simply murmured something about Torngaruk before refusing to answer any further questions. And at this point, it occurred to the authorities that Salmek might talk if he got intoxicated. And so they gave the other Inuit man a bottle of whiskey and told him to get Salmek drunk so that he might share his secrets. But Salmek didn't like the whiskey, so he didn't drink it, and as a result, the investigators learned nothing. And because nobody would talk, it's impossible to say if either the boy or Salmek came from the vanished village, and thus we are left with nothing but Labelle's story to go off of. The presence of the rifle, clothes, and other belongings is puzzling, as it suggests a rapid abandonment of the settlement with little time to gather non-essential items. The presence of the dogs leads to other questions entirely, especially since we have no information on how long the unfortunate ones have been dead when Labelle arrived. One possibility is that the whole band up and left suddenly, that something befell them on the trail, and so the dogs returned to the nearest home they knew. But even if that is what happens, it still leaves the question of why they left in the first place, and it seems that mystery may never be solved. Perhaps there never was a village after all, and the story really was just something invented by Kelleher and Labelle. Perhaps the RCMP knows exactly what happened, and they're responsible, and that's why they don't want to speak about it. Or perhaps it was something outside the realm of our understanding. Now, it might be worth mentioning that this is actually not the only disappearing village story in Canada that we have seen. It's not even the only one we've talked about. And it's also not the only disappearing village story in North America by a long shot. The most famous is obviously the disappearance of the Roanoke colony, which we do have a very long video on from a while ago. It's actually one of my favorite ones we've done, and I recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it. And contrary to popular belief, the Roanoke mystery is actually not as much of a mystery anymore as it was 20 years ago. There have been a lot of advancements and a lot of things learned about their fate, including these dare stones that for a long time were perceived to be a hoax, but now they think at least one of them is real. The more enigmatic of these disappearances, in my opinion, is the one from the Nahanni River Valley. And if you want to check that out, we also have actually several videos on the whole Nahanni situation, but it's our most recent one on that story that is, in my opinion, the best written, the best quality, and goes into the most depth about this disappearance of a tribe called the Naha. And part of the reason that the Naha story is so intriguing, now that we have this one as well, is just how similar they are. Now, there's actually less primary source information regarding that one. It seems to come mostly out of the northern Dene oral tradition, but it does describe a village that was known to be there, that people had seen before, that one day a band of warriors got up there because the Naha were some naughty boys. Anyway, a band of these Dene warriors gets up there to fight the Naha to end their reign of terror, and everybody's gone. It's hard to say exactly how old the story is. Nobody really seems to know. It goes back, in some cases, it's, time immemorial, and then in other cases, it's a couple hundred years ago, or even, the time of my great-grandfather. But, and when I say my great-grandfather, I mean like the storyteller is saying it's from the time of their great-grandfather. However, in Native American storytelling, that was also a way of just saying it was a very long time ago. To say it was in my grandfather's time was in the recent past, and to say if it was beyond that was often used as it was in the distant past. And another one of the interesting things about this set of disappearing village stories is that they come from 3 totally separate Native American cultures. Or in the case of Roanoke, the mix of Carolina Algonquian and English. But to be fair, when I do look at this story, as plausible as the Kelleher version is, and as interesting as the story turns out to be, as a historian, there is not a ton of evidence that this happened. I'm not saying that to say that I don't think it did, or that I don't think it was worth looking into, or that it's a bad story. I'm just, for the sake of clarity, if somebody came to me as a historian and said, hey, is there strong evidence that this happened? I would say no. But as a lover of mysteries and culture and folklore and all these things, I do find it fascinating as a study topic. And there were a number of things I came across while looking at it that were interesting. For example, there is the cairn that was there that the 1948 guys, in their opinion, this cairn wasn't just not of Inuit construction. It was of Franklin expedition construction. There have also been others who have looked at it and gone, that might even be earlier. It might be from explorers in the 1700s. But as I was saying, really interesting thing about this cairn that was found at Angikuni Lake, when they opened it up and took a look inside, there was a dovetail wooden box in there. And what I mean is that it was a wooden chest constructed with dovetail joints. And one group of people who would use dovetail joints in chest construction and were known to build cairns were the Norse. And when you take a look at where Angikuni Lake and Baker Lake, all of that are in relation to the furthest western permanent settlement of the Norse, that being Greenland, it's due west. We do, of course, know about the Viking settlement at Lanzo Meadows in Newfoundland, however it is supposed to be said. Every time I say it, I'm wrong somehow. My point in saying that is, that's the extent of our archaeological knowledge regarding the Norse settlement, is we found it, and we're still learning things. As for the documentary evidence, there are several sagas of the Greenlanders, Saga of Eric the Red, that mention the Norse settlement, and with varying details. We don't know if they're exhaustive. They're pretty vague about the journey to get there, and there's been a good amount of discussion on what exactly certain terms and descriptions mean. But it's not impossible that there were further Norse expeditions into Canada and what would become, the United States. But that is definitely a topic for another time and one that I have in the pipeline, so be on the lookout for a video about the Norse settlements in North America and the potential that there were more of them. And if you are sitting here watching this as another medieval historian who is currently about to tear their hair out and go, no, Aiden, please, don't worry, I'm not saying there were. I'm just saying we're going to explore the possibilities and what evidence there is, and I'm going to make it fun. Because I can tell you one thing for sure, and that's that the version of it that you got in the TV show Vikings was not accurate. And also the way that the Norse who got there responded to seeing Native Americans was very different from the way that the English responded to it 500 years later. As in, the English were way nicer. But if you would like to support us as we continue to try and bring you more new, interesting content of varying styles about different things, you can do that by obviously liking this video, subscribing to the channel, sharing it with your friends, hitting that notification bell. The notification bell is a big one, by the way. For some reason, even though YouTube doesn't give you the notifications when the video comes out, they're really intense about how many of you click that notification bell. If you want more timely notifications, however, the best way to do that is to join our Discord, where you will get them at exactly the time they are needed, and that you can join by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge or clicking on the link in the description. If you'd like to give us some more direct support, we would be very grateful for that, and you can do so through Patreon or by becoming a member here on YouTube, but I will be honest with you, our Patreon is the better value. You get more bang for your buck over there. There are mugs and posters and t-shirts and stuff like that that you just don't get through the YouTube membership. But aside from those gifts that you get after 3 months of membership on Patreon, you also get access to Liquored Lore, our version of drunk history, basically. If you're looking to get something directly from us, if you'd like to wear the lodge and feel like you're in our skin, you can do so by going to bunkerbranding.com, scrolling over to the Lore Lodge section, and purchasing one of the 4 t-shirt designs or 2 hoodie designs we have over there. If you are more interested in drinking the lodge, then you can go to tableauroastingco.com and go to their collaborations tab to order Mount Pocono Perk, our signature coffee blend that I designed myself as a former barista. I did not just pick it off of the shelf on Spotify and then rebrand it. It's the coffee I drink every day, it's the coffee Thornbury drinks every day, it's the coffee that several members of my family drink every day. And at just $16 a bag plus shipping, it's actually extraordinarily well priced for being a YouTube creator signature coffee. And finally, if you are looking for more Lodge, we have it. We have our brand new podcast, History Unhinged, which we do with Stephen Bell of Sakuyi and History of Everything. We also have the Weird Bible, which we do with Wendigoon and is the last Thursday of the month over on the Weird Bible channel. History Unhinged also has its own channel. And then there's my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, where I mostly stream video games. We'll play stuff like The Forest and Helldivers with a little group. And those are actually pretty fun. We get a few hundred people watching. We have some drinks. It's good times. And those are Friday night from 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern over on the Aiden Mattis channel, youtube.com/@theaidenmattis, unless they aren't, and usually I'm pretty good about letting you know that. In fact, you'll usually be able to tell because there will be a redirect at the end of our premiere that sends you over to that channel. So if there's not, then there's not a stream. And then we have 2 channels that we produce, but that we are not part of. At least we're not on camera or writing things. And those are Boozy Mixologist with our buddy Celso, and Off the Record with our buddy Luke. They are, as you would imagine, mixology and music channels. We recommend going to check those out. There's going to be some cool content coming up this summer as we revitalize those. And there is The Lore Lads, our live show, which is every Monday at 7 p.m. unless it isn't, and if it isn't, we'll tell you. That also comes out on podcast listening platforms as a video or audio podcast on the Wednesday following the premiere. With all of that said, thank you guys for watching. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge. If you'd prefer to drink the lodge and have us fill you with warmth, you can get our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company.